Okay, here we go. Good morning, everyone. I see people are coming in now. Hello, hello. I'll just give it one more moment for people to start. Welcome, welcome. Okay, so I'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I know we have people joining us from all around the world, which is exciting. My name is Jillian Avendano. I'm the program director at FIU's Center for International Business Education and Research. We're one of 15 cyber centers throughout the US with a Title VI grant from the US Department of Education. Our main goal is to promote US competitiveness in international business, and we do so for the community, the faculty and students as well. And we're excited to welcome you to our International Business webinar series with the title, The Business of Tourism in Greater Miami, Local Approaches to Issues of Global Sustainable Tourism. And we're collaborating with FIU's Chaplin School of Hospitality and Tourism Management. And we're joined by experts from around this beautiful city of Miami who are going to be weighing in with their perspective and their experience on this pressing topic. And as we go on, we invite you all to enter questions into the question and answer box, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. So without further ado, let me go ahead and pass it along to my colleague, Mr. Marcos Santos.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marcos, and I'm the student assistant here at Cyber. Today, our panelists will be answering some key questions, including what does the business of tourism post-COVID look like in South Florida, and in what ways will the destination tailor to new tourist demands as it aims to become more resilient and mitigate environmental, social, cultural, and economic impacts to the area. Our panelists will discuss current threats and issues as well as opportunities. And without further ado, I pass the floor to Dr. Bushman.
Good day, y'all, and thank you, Jillian and FIU Cyber for putting together today's really interesting and I think timely webinar. So I'm Dr. John Bushman. I'm a lecturer at the FIU Chaplin School of Hospitality and Tourism Management and co-director of the new Global Sustainable Tourism degree program, along with Dr. Carolyn Lusby, who you're going to meet in a few minutes. I came to FIU after about 28 years in the global hospitality and tourism industry. Gained experience across Latin America, the Caribbean, Europe, Africa. My undergraduate degree is in travel and tourism from Michigan State. I earned my master's here at the Chaplin School. And I got my doctorate in social welfare from FIU's Stempel School of Public Health and Social Work, where I specialized in community food security and the redistribution of food from hospitality operations. So we're here today to talk about the enormous importance of sustainability in the tourism business, which is, by some measures, the world's largest industry. And certainly it is that here in Florida. I don't have to tell you that all the impacts of tourism on the natural environment, increasing scrutiny from all sides. I also don't have to tell you about the impacts of climate change, of health pandemics, red tides and algal blooms of our tourism industry, which really for decades has been Florida's economic engine. But before we get into the discussion with this really stellar panel of experts, I want to announce that we are now matriculating students for our new Bachelor of Arts degree in Global Sustainable Tourism. We will be starting this up in January of 2022. Yes, we just launched a new online undergraduate degree in Global Sustainable Tourism here at FIU. This degree was actually conceived before the pandemic crisis struck our industry and our lives, but we see even more clearly now just how important this topic is both for the future of Florida's environment and for Florida's largest industry. It began as a discussion really about the fragility of the industry when faced with environment issues of recent years, such as the so-called red tides, the blue-green algal blooms, health concerns with Zika, beach erosions and pollution, and of course, sea level rise. but no one could have predicted the COVID-19 pandemic when we first started planning this new degree program. Now, from the get-go, this was to be an interdisciplinary collaboration between our Chaplain School and the FIU Department of Earth and Environment. In doing our research, we found just 6 or 7 programs around the country, really anything like it, and none in Florida. So we knew it was going to be an important new degree here at FIU. Of those 6 or 7 in other states, none really blended such an expertise-laden curriculum as we have, where roughly half the courses being taught by experienced tourism educators like Carolyn and myself, and the other half by an impressive cadre of environmental and geoscientists that we are so lucky to have teaching and researching here at FIU. It's a blended curriculum that offers the best of our existing courses, such as Ecology of South Florida and Climate Change Policy, with newly developed courses such as Sustainability and Wellbeing in Societies and Global Sustainable Resource Development and Natural Resources. Now, you may have heard of Dr. Stephen Leatherman, AKA Dr. Beach, who creates, the top 10 beach list every year. He's created a totally new course for the degree on beaches and tourism that brings together his 4 decades of beach research into the heart of the program. So we're really excited about these kind of collaborations. Now, I would like to introduce you to my friend and colleague, Dr. Carolyn Lusby, who will moderate today's really amazing program of panelists. We're lucky to have Carolyn as the principal professor and co-director of the global program. Carolyn earned her PhD from the University of Florida in Tourism and Natural Resources and her master's from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. She's a Green Globe certified auditor, a board member of Florida Society for Ethical Ecotourism, and chair of the Special Interest Group in Tourism of the World Leisure Organization. She's widely published on the subject of sustainable tourism, no doubt. Just this year, she just published a new book called Destination Unknown, Sustainable Travel and Ethical Tourism. And also this year, she has a chapter featured in the Handbook for Sustainable Tourism Practitioners. So I would like to hand it over to my colleague, Carolyn Lusby.
Hello, good morning, everybody. We're here to chat about tourism in Miami, and I am super excited to introduce our panelists. And I encourage everybody who is participating or attending, if you have any questions for any of the panelists or the panel in general, please feel free to put your questions in the chat box. And that way we can draw on you and answer all of your questions. So we're hoping that this will be an interactive and very informative session for everybody. So tourism is exciting business. I love tourism. Miami, of course, we're super known for tourism. And what we want to know is, are we using this COVID crisis that we had, this sort of a break in tourism, to actually rebuild the industry in other ways? Or are we looking to reform certain things, or are we going with the status quo? So in order to answer some of these questions, I would like the panel to introduce themselves. So Rolando, would you like to firstly introduce yourself, who you are, and then maybe also answer just briefly what you feel makes South Florida and Miami so special as a tourism destination?
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this webinar. And first and foremost, I'm a proud graduate of FIU, right? So I don't know if any of you knew that, but and so is my wife, by the way. So I have deep roots at FIU and in the community. I've lived here my whole life. I've been working at the Greater Miami Convention and Visitors Bureau half of that life, promoting this destination. And it's been a very challenging 17-month period. It's not the only crisis that we've gone through as a community. I've been here, I've seen everything from oil spills to multiple hurricanes to Zika, and arguably all of those have elements of sustainability that we need to account for. But I do think that the current pandemic is truly giving us an opportunity to kind of take a step back and look at some of the historical metrics of success of tourism and reevaluate those. So, we have been giving this a lot of thought in terms of what the future holds, and I look forward to sharing some more thoughts with you, your audience, and the rest of the panel.
Perfect, great. So we'll just go around. Elaine, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, good morning. Good morning, everybody. My name is Elaine Heldeveer. I'm a sustainability professional working in the field for over 20 years. I currently work for Carnival Corporation and I lead their sustainability disclosures and practices. I'm also a graduate of FIU. I got my master's at FIU, and it is a wonderful opportunity to get together and have these conversations. Um, I've lived in Miami most of my life, and it is a wonderful city to be in. Miami tourism is extremely important. Um, and I think one of the key areas why Miami is so important is because of its geographical location. It's really the gateway to the Americas, to the Caribbean. And because of our climate, um, during winter season, where the rest of the US is experiencing very, very, very cold weather, we actually have an amazing weather. And it brings those snowbirds here. So that is a population that always returns, not only for leisure, but they also have a lot of homes here. They have, most of them have a lot of second homes here in the area. So Miami is amazing. And besides the weather, it's beauty and tourism. It's one of the key industries within the state.
Thank you so much, Elaine. Wonderful to have you. And I would like to call Dr. Wodorowski. Would you like to introduce yourself and your specialty?
Hi, good morning. My name is Shimon Verdovinsky, and I'm a professor at the Institute of the Environment, the Department of Earth and Environment here at Florida International University. And I'm coming from a different background. I'm a geophysicist. I study the environment. I use a lot of science and quantitative tools. And over the past decade, I start looking more and more at the environments, how we coexist with nature and how nature is affecting us. I've studied sea level rise, studied land subsidence here in Miami Beach and other communities, and trying to understand the threats and opportunities that we have over here. As we all know, we have the issue of climate change, that the human is interaction, how human is affecting the natural environment and vice versa. So I think it's very important to understand both aspects, how we human affecting the natural environment and the environment, natural environment is affecting us, both the positive and the negative aspects. I'm looking forward for the discussion. You're mute, please.
Thank you so much for your input. I think one of the things that we really noticed with this forced break in tourism that we saw all over the world is how much of the environment was actually rebounding. And thank you for using that word, Rolando, right? When we stopped those threats from tourism, that over-tourism that we were seeing before the pandemic. And I think another really important topic here is this whole idea of rebound, that throughout different crises, tourism has always rebounded. But the question is, in what ways are we rebounding? How long does it take, right? And do we want to rebound to where we were before? Or are we using this to actually model new ways that tourism can function more in a balance with the environment, people, and planet to have more of a well-being type of an industry that does well for everybody? And I think that's where these terms that we hear now all over the tourism industry, such as regenerative tourism, restorative tourism even, come in. So I would like to get your perspective from, I don't know who wants to start. Where are we in South Florida as a destination with that? Are we seeing new opportunities for new types of tourism? Are we trying to rebound to where we were before? How are we restructuring tourism in South Florida?
So, I'll jump in there, and I know I did want to expand a little bit upon the impact of tourism, historically to Miami-Dade County, South Florida in general. I mean, practically 1 out of 5 people in Miami-Dade County are directly employed in the travel and tourism industry. It's a $25 billion industry. Historically, we were all proud of saying we had record this and record that, and And you know, and I think because of the pandemic, but even prior to that, you know, that word that was mentioned earlier, over tourism, and whether it's Venice or Amsterdam or Barcelona, or, you know, there's examples where, you know, the community has just been overwhelmed, especially during certain time periods with arguably over tourism. And even in Miami-Dade County, there are instances of that as well, not generally, but, you know, within certain areas and within certain times. So this has been something on our radar screen before the pandemic, and that's why we have been working closely with city and county governments on how we can balance a successful tourism economy that drives so much economic development, but balance that against resident quality of life. And this is something that I think now has been exponentially magnified. And even though we are the Greater Miami Convention and Visitors Bureau, and that word visitors is important, I think that if we adjust our thinking and think is what is in the best interest of our residents in building this community in a balanced way, then by default, it's going to be more interesting to the visitors, because our research clearly demonstrates that it's just not the beauty of our beaches and our climate, but, you know, visitors want to go to where locals are, and that's in our neighborhoods, and that's experiencing the different types of aspects that Miami-Dade County has grown up into. So I think moving forward, you know, we had just completed a strategic plan before the pandemic, which touched upon some of these areas. But now that we've gone through this pandemic, you know, we want to shift in our thinking from a volume business, which just means more, to a yield business, which means our strategy moving forward is like a hotelier. They don't mind having a little less occupancy if they can have a higher room rate, and ultimately that achieves a similar economic goal with less pressure on their asset, their hotel. And I think my thinking and our thinking is to adopt some of those practices, and I believe some of our colleagues on the panel may have similar thoughts, because I know hotels do that, I know airlines do that, I believe cruise lines do that, and it's a yield management approach, which will also help us with this concept of visitor dispersal. So, you know, the other thing that we're looking to do is using technology is to do a better job of managing visitor flows within our community in real time, and by using classic sales and marketing initiatives, you know, digital and mobile based, we can incentivize people to move to different parts of our community, thereby alleviating some of that pressure on any one aspect of our community. So this is very, very near and dear to us. As I mentioned earlier, last week I was with some colleagues at a conference from Iceland, from Gothenburg, and from Singapore, specifically on this topic. Quite frankly, they're way ahead of us on many of these. I think the US in general is lagging the world on sustainability. So we're looking to learn from some of those colleagues so that we can implement what makes best sense for our community here.
And what does that more highly yielding tourist look like? What is the characteristic, the personality, the wants and needs of that tourist? Do we know that?
Well, we know that Miami-Dade County, Miami in general, has evolved so dramatically, and historically, going way back in the day. And again, I've been here most of my life, and perhaps some panelists have some fresher perspective or some outside perspective, but, you know, the perception of Miami only being this place where you go to the beach and you party hard in our nightclubs, which are amazing, by the way. But one of the things that we did during the pandemic, our recovery strategy, we didn't mention our beaches necessarily. We didn't mention our nightlife. What we mentioned was our amazing outdoor spaces, our natural assets. People are, you know, we're blessed to have 3 national parks in Miami. Perhaps some of you didn't even know that. And we went out of our way for all the right reasons to better educate the visitors that as we were inviting them to come back, we wanted to use this pandemic as a moment and an opportunity to reset the perception, or in some cases, the misperception of what this community has to offer. So by doing that, we are expanding our customer base, and then we can be more strategic in terms of pursuing those that fully appreciate the broad Miami-Dade County experience, which of course includes our beaches, but also includes our arts and our culture and our eco and agritourism opportunities in the southern part of our community, and our heritage tourism that's happening in some of those neighborhoods. and generally research is showing that people that further appreciate those types of experience generate higher yield, and those are the ones that we will be building incremental sales and marketing efforts to attract and bring into this community, which, by the way, also helps us spread the wealth of tourism far and beyond our traditional tourism centers that most of you are familiar with.
Right. And I agree. And I think a lot of the studies show that eco-tourists, cultural tourists spend more on trips. They are higher yielding tourists. Dr. Shimon, have you studied anything on ecotourism, or what would be some of the natural attractions that those types of tourists would be interested in?
Actually, I'm not an expert in tourism, but I'm studying the environment. And I think what happened over the past year and more is we have a situation where it's less attractive for students, like we have the red tide and we have the Biscayne, the crisis with the Biscayne Bay, which we must address in order to keep the tourists come over here. We cannot say that it's we live in a place that only part of the year is it's nice to be here. We need to be in a place that I should be here all year round. And the issue of Biscayne Bay, actually it's not new. 30 years ago, Tampa Bay suffered from similar situation, and they addressed it in a massive way. And I think because tourism is such an important industry over here, we have to take a holistic approach and address the situation of Biscayne Bay. And everything is related to the natural environment, because the tourism is not in vacuum. As mentioned before, the natural environment is one of the main things people come over here, and we need to be prepared for that.
Correct. And I think one of the pressing things is, what do we stand to lose when we lose our natural attractions, such as our beaches, our coral reefs, our oceans? Elaine, I was wondering about your perspective in terms of this new type of tourist as the director of sustainability. Who is that tourist that you're attracting that is more focused on sustainability? And do you see more demand where maybe cruise passengers are asking more about sustainable operations and so on?
Sure. I wanted to start by saying that at the end of the day, it's all about achieving a balance. When we're talking about sustainable tourism for destinations, it is the environmental component of the destination, as well as the social, the cultural aspect of that destination. And there are different types of tourists, let's say. Some will be more inclined to the environmental component, and others are looking more as to the cultural part of it. And so there is a broad pool of tourists that are available worldwide to have different experiences. So the destinations, depending on their natural resources and cultural resources, are able to cater to different aspects of this tourism population. I think in general, we can all agree that the world is becoming more and more aware of how important it is to be sustainable, that to preserve our natural resources, to preserve our cultural heritage, and that it is important to highlight those components. And as Rolando said, for example, here in Miami and South Florida, it's not just the beaches, we also have the Everglades. It's still part of the natural environment, but it's a very different environment that the beach component. And our culture here, like I mentioned earlier, Miami is the gateway to the Americas, and we have such a huge melting pot here that also that attracts a lot of individuals that want to experience that. So it's different aspects, and it all depends what we want to highlight. But overall, keeping in mind that we have to keep a balance. We have to understand the carrying capacity of each of those aspects. So we don't want to over advertise, because when we do that, we also limit the value of the experience. And we all want to make sure that when people visit a location, they get the full experience. Whether you are the provider or you're the one who is, actually having the experience. We ourselves do travel, do visit different locations. So it's finding that balance that is key.
Right. And I think, as you mentioned correctly, these measures of carrying capacity also incorporate social measures of feeling crowded, where tourists in the end also will feel that there's a diminishing of the actual tourist experience with too many people, just as Rolando was saying, this sense of over tourism. And yet, even with this desire to kind of curb over tourism and this desire to create more balance, we see in so many destinations in the world that tourism is starting to rebound to kind of this pre-COVID over tourism. Cruise ships are returning to Venice. Amsterdam is trying with different things. New Zealand is trying to actually pay some of the smaller villages to develop other industries besides tourism. And yet we see so much return to kind of the status quo. And so I think I want to move our discussion to what can we do in Miami, in Greater Miami, to really shift into creating more of that balance. And I think to start that discussion, maybe we can talk about what really are the most pressing threats that we have. I know we mentioned briefly, we mentioned red tide, we mentioned the Everglades, but from your perspectives, what are some of those most pressing threats that we experience in South Florida?
I'll jump in there and just, you mentioned business coming back to normal. I mean, we're monitoring, obviously, through our recovery index, the volume of business that our airports are doing, that our hotels are doing. We're even monitoring the amount of dinner reservations through APIs and technology. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the business demand for some of the traditional tourism experiences is actually at pre-COVID levels and even beyond. When we look at the number of hotel rooms that we're selling, we are above the 100% index. Our restaurants are 130, 140%. And even our airport is at about 96, 97% in overall volume of where it was pre-pandemic. And based on what we're understanding, they will easily surpass that in the coming months with some additional service. So, for all intents and purposes, right now from a tourism industry perspective, from the business perspective, the greatest challenge is not the demand. It's managing demand, and I've been working on workforce issues, identifying qualified talent at every level, not just entry level, to help cope with this demand. And I think it is compelling a lot of the businesses to rethink their business model and to what extent, what layers of management they need to be successful moving forward. So the business is there, and it is challenging because to really effectuate change, it's going to require the industry itself to recognize that, okay, it's fine for me to think of, volume versus yield and look at it holistically and look at these, issues that are impacting this community. But it does require buy-in from the industry itself, including the hotels, obviously, the restaurants and others, because they have lost an amazing amount of resource and revenue over the last 2 years. So right now, they're trying to make up for what they lost. So the mindset is going to be quite challenging for some, not for all, to kind of rethink that and be more deliberate in terms of how you rebuild better. But that's our responsibility, I think, as a community, and not just to our office, but especially to our elected leaders. Some of you may know that Miami-Dade County, under the leadership of Daniela Levine Cava, mayor, she appointed a chief bay officer. I know our colleague Simon, was talking about Biscayne Bay and how critically important it is. All major metropolitan areas in Miami-Dade County now have chief resiliency officers, which is great. City of Miami Beach, City of Miami, Miami-Dade County. That wasn't the case not too long ago. And as many of you may know, we've also been tapped by the Rockefeller Foundation and their Resilient Cities Network. So, there is momentum, there's progress, but at the very least, there's acknowledgement that something needs to be done. we have these precious assets, and I know I talked earlier about all the different experiences that we have to offer, but ultimately, yeah, whether it's our bay or our beaches, the water quality, sea level rise, the city of Miami Beach, for those of you that may not know, has spent a fortune in raising their roads, installing pumps. The king tide, the sunny day flooding is becoming more common. And again, it's terrible for residents, which is first and foremost, but it also is terrible for the visitors, especially as we try to bring visitors in a responsible way. We spent $625 million just before the pandemic on renovating the convention center, which is right there, steps away from the ocean on Miami Beach. It is LEED silver. It was raised a couple of inches, so there are some more sustainable measures in that facility. But I think this is a true threat to us all. And I manage the communications and the PR as well. So it's not just the practical issues that are happening as well, but right now, when I'm trying to bring events or conventions to Miami Beach, Greater Miami-Dade County, we are getting asked more and more, what are you as a community doing in terms of resiliency and sustainable tourism? Talk to me about your LEED certifications, talk to me about carbon offsets, and especially, as I mentioned earlier, from some of those international meetings and conventions that are more sensitive to those topics. So it's posing a threat right now. It's not at that level, perhaps, that it is in other communities, but definitely is something that that we're closely monitoring.
Thank you for that. And I agree. I think managing those tourist expectations, managing the numbers, figuring out what the carrying capacity is and how we can restructure that flow of tourists is definitely one of the big challenges and is a threat to, that over tourism that we were at before. And I think one of the key things is the data, right? Monitoring, like you were saying, the amount of tourism, the resources. Dr. Shimon or Elaine, what are some of the ways we could monitor some of the other resources that we have?
I wanted to say something when you mentioned that we're rebounding. I think in respect to the tourism, one of the things in the early day of the pandemic when we all were in lockdown and everybody mentioned how the nature, the environment actually came back to the natural environment rebounded when people stopped being there. Like in Venice, they saw dolphins and all of that. I think it's a very important lesson that we should take from the pandemic, that we can we should have the nature be at its best and not always be there in order for us to enjoy the nature. So it's something to appreciate. Another thing that actually is a negative thing that came from the pandemic is that we use a lot of recyclables. And everything, there's so much stress on the environment in terms of disposables. And we should try to eliminate or reduce the amount of disposables that we are using in order to reduce the stress from the environment, from the landfill and all of that. And that we'll try to not just use recyclables, but to try to reduce the amount of things. Now, regarding to sea level rise, this is something that has been studied for a decade. And here in Southeast Florida is very important because it's a great threat. We've been suffering from this king tide or nuisance flooding, how it's called. And it's indeed the city of Miami Beach put a great effort to raise the streets and to erect seawalls, which reduce significantly the amount of flooding event. But still, when we have a very high king tide, it affects the entire city or many parts of the city and other communities over here. And we need to think long terms, not just short terms, because all of these measures are good for maybe the next 10 years, 15 years. But if we're going to continue with the burning fossil fuel in the rates that have been done in the fall, and not going to try to stop the use of carbon emissions. We shouldn't expect that the sea level will rise at lower rate. I mean, this is what happens, that the sea level is rising, what's called as the different projections, and so far we are following the projection which called the business as usual, when we don't curb down the carbon emissions. And so we have to be very alert about that and try to use measures in order to reduce the use of carbon emissions, either by using carbon offsets. That's something maybe the tourist industry should put more emphasis how to be carbon neutral. Some airlines are already committing for that. Some countries are committing for that. And I think we should be in the forefront of that, and not to be passive and wait to see what other people, our country or organization are doing. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to add that resiliency is key, and what Miami is doing right now with the resilience officers is step on the right direction. Being included in the resilient cities is also a huge step in that direction. We all understand that because of the severe weather patterns that we have been experiencing for the past couple of years, and are continuing, we are vulnerable to weather, to severe weather, aside from the hurricanes. And right now we're in hurricane season. We get this all of a sudden storms. Making sure, as Rolando mentioned, that we have the right infrastructure in place to be able to mitigate those impacts is extremely important. I wanted to mention that we, in every situation when we experience a challenge, we can see the glass half full or half empty. And there were challenges, there are also opportunities. So not only the city is doing, revamping the infrastructure to be able to manage the weathers, also what's happening within the community, the level of education that we get from the government in terms of information being available before, during, and after storm. That's extremely important as well. But one thing that I have learned through the years is that mangroves are essential for resiliency. And they're essential in the sense of, number one, they are a wave attenuation. When you have mangroves on the coastline, it helps attenuate the impacts of the waves. In our shoreline, we have extensive mangroves, but using that to look into how we can make that connection of mangroves even better will facilitate the resiliency, will improve the resiliency of the city. Mangroves are also an excellent source, excuse me, for for carbon sequestration. They actually have approximately 10% more carbon sequestration than tropical forests. So that's a huge component. In addition to that, they're also considered fish, they provide the habitat for the fish community. That's where they hang out, that's where they live. So it's an amazing resource that we have in our backyard. And going back to emissions and carbon, we all need to do our part in terms of reducing our emissions. We as an individual, whatever industry we work in, understanding what is our carbon footprint and what can be what can be done to reduce it, to minimize it, what kind of technologies are currently available to support those that direction to reduce and eliminate carbon is extremely important. One of the things that I wanted to highlight is, for instance, here in Miami, we see a lot of electrical cars. We see tons of Teslas driving around in our city, and it's great that we have that technology, but we also have to look at the big picture and determine where is that electricity coming from. Is it coming from renewable sources? Is it coming from solar? Or is it coming for hydrocarbons? So there's many levels of or layers, if you would, to look at all these issues. And as long as we start and be diligent at looking at them and how can we take them to the next level is extremely important. Technology is key, but awareness is essential. And also using the infrastructure that is already available for everybody to use is extremely important. For example, we have the framework for the resilient cities, but there's also an important framework that is available for all to use, which is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And then within UN Sustainable Development Goals, you have 17 goals that if you go through the exercise of looking at all of them, they all touch the entire sustainability scope of the world, of an individual, of a community, of a city, whichever way you want to cut and dice it. And within those, climate action is one of them. And so many components. So I just want to raise the point that there's a lot of structure available for communities, individuals, businesses to use. So there's no need to reinvent the wheel. Right. It is important to use resources that are publicly available.
Thank you, Elaine. And I agree. And I think these new challenges and these new collaborations are going to require for all of us to work together to put the right information out to the residents, to tourists. I wanted to give Tom Moore the chance to introduce himself finally, and to also kind of bring us the viewpoint of NOAA and talking about these structures and restoring systems. He's a specialist in coral restoration and what we're doing with our reefs. I wanted to briefly give him a chance to join the conversation here.
Sure. Thanks, Carolyn, and apologize for not being able to start to 11:30 and then having Zoom issues after that. So thank you. My name is Tom Moore. I am with NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, where I manage our coral reef restoration activities around the world, but with a significant focus on South Florida and the Florida Keys. I help lead the Mission Iconic Reefs effort, which is an effort to really try to turn around the reefs of the Florida Keys from a state of significant decline to a place where we're hopefully at least putting them on a path towards thriving again. It's important to understand that coral reefs in Florida and unfortunately around the world, but Florida has certainly been on the precipice of it, have suffered dramatic declines over the course of the last 40 years. It's often easily forgotten as we kind of look out at the water and not pay as much attention to what's underneath them. But these coral reefs, which are really the foundation of so much of South Florida's ecosystem to begin with, have really gone from being the predominant feature to being barren wastelands underwater in many places. And for a long time, we've been talking about restoring these reefs, but we haven't been able to kind of articulate a broader vision for that, what that really looks like. And over the course of the last 2 years, we've launched an effort in the Florida Keys, Mission Iconic Reefs, to truly define exactly what's necessary to turn this system around and take it from what was once a thriving system to being a system that's essentially a desert back to a thriving system. And so we launched a $100 million initiative, which is not fully funded, but it's a goal. It's setting the goals for what it'll need to take 7 of these reef sites in the Florida Keys and fundamentally turn them around, because we actually know through our work over the course of the last decade that we really can restore these systems using similar techniques that we can use on land to restore forests or to restore other habitats. We can begin to rebuild these reefs. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of resources, but it really is critical to our economy as we move forward. It's not just something to kind of think about in the abstract. We will begin to see losses from this, but we also have the opportunity to have a lot of gain on this side of things too. A lot of times people talk about the loss of tourism or the loss of economic drivers as a relationship to the coral reef crisis. I actually like to flip that conversation around a little bit and think that if we can truly begin to make the investments that are necessary in Florida, Florida can start to become the poster child of kind of the recovery of these systems. This is a problem around the world. We can take that narrative and shift it and talk about the economy that we can create through the intersection of tourism and restoration and all of the other things there. So really encourage folks to think about it, encourage folks to, contact me if you have opportunities for people to make investments on this front. It is a battle we can fight and a battle we can win, and one that I really think can have tremendous mutual benefits moving forward between the tourism sector and the economic sector and the restoration sector.
Thank you, Tom. And I think the coral reefs are such a great example because, as you were saying, everything is interrelated, and what happens on land, what happens in the Everglades is impacting our reefs. And so I think that brings me back to this question of what collaborations do we currently already have in place between maybe the city of Miami, the tourism industry, the environmental agencies, where we are able to tackle some of these issues and work across sections, across private, public sector to address some of these issues and actually flip some of those things upside down.
I'll share my 2 cents, and I really appreciate listening from the panelists from NOAA. And, on that note, there's not many folks that know that in Miami-Dade County, we not only have an amazing natural coral system, which unfortunately has been decimated in some cases, but we also have this artificial reef program that is actually world renowned, and it definitely is a driver for interest in our destination. So what happens beneath the water naturally and even man-made is so critical to our success. I will say with FIU and bringing stakeholders together, and we are a public-private organization. We're relatively small. We're about 50 staff here, and our historic mission has been to bring visitors, meetings, conventions, and events, right? That's how we were built many years ago, and that's frankly how most of our organizations were built. I think many of us, not just globally, but domestically, are reevaluating our mission and expanding it to include issues such as this. But I do think that, it will require some additional horsepower. And I think what FIU, by launching this global sustainable tourism program, obviously the pandemic, the advent of the chief resiliency officers, this is a broader conversation. I think we as a tourism organization definitely need to be at the table, including everyone else on this panel, but it truly needs leadership at the highest levels. And it looks like we have that in place with our county. But I do think that FIU, as one of our premier, not just local institutions, but global institutions when it comes to hospitality management, can also play a leadership role in perhaps bringing ourselves, our city and county elected leaders, experts such as NOAA and others, and make it, no pun intended, a sustainable effort looking at this. Because I think what happens quite often, there's all this great momentum and energy, and unless it becomes institutionalized in our mindset, and whether you call it a standing task force or whatever however you want to package that, I think bringing together thought leaders and relevant organizations, including ourselves, and looking at this critically, and introspectively, I think that will breed new ideas, and more importantly, commitment in sweat equity and financial at all levels. So, I mean, we are fully committed because this is an existential threat to our industry. Obviously, that's what we primarily do for a living, but it's much bigger than us because it's truly about this community as a whole. So we're hoping that the community as a whole can play an active role on some of these longer term solutions.
Yeah, and it is also important to have formal channels and informal channels as well for people to convey their opinions in a way to communicate back and forward. But having both is important, formal and informal.
In what ways are residents, we talked a lot about residents and the importance of also collecting information from them, of also ensuring quality of life for residents, which also includes keeping our ecosystems alive. In what ways are residents actually being surveyed or included in some of these decisions and in some of these new pathways? So Jillian posted a quick survey if anybody can just go and click through it while we're speaking. But Tom, are you guys specifically working with residents as well in the Keys?
Yeah. So there's a tremendous opportunity on this front. It's not something, when we're talking about coral reef restoration, there's multiple different ways for residents to get involved. Certainly one that is probably obvious, but important that it's said anyways, is just awareness and advocacy. It really does matter, and it's important that people recognize that these resources are there. But for residents in particular, we do have opportunities through the programs in Miami, through the University of Miami and their Rescue a Reef program, or our various efforts throughout the Florida Keys with the Coral Restoration Foundation, entities like iCare and Reef Renewal and Mote Marine Laboratory. All of those organizations have opportunities for dedicated resident volunteers to get involved. It's not necessarily the type of activity that you can just decide you're going to do one Saturday afternoon and show up and do it like maybe a beach cleanup is. It does require some training and commitment beforehand and some long-term commitment to you to get to be, kind of worth having that training done for you. We absolutely have those opportunities. Each of those organizations have information on their websites about how people can get involved. And they are very much looking for those kind of what we like to refer to as super volunteers, the people that really are willing to put the time in to become an expert at how to do some of these things. And they can become great sources for the community. In addition to that, we have opportunities for both residents as well as tourists to get involved through some of the dive training programs that are run by a number of the dive shops, in particular in the Florida Keys. So there's a handful of dive shops that actually run programs where you can choose to come in just for a day. You take a short course and learn about coral reef restoration, about the coral reef crisis, and then you have an opportunity to go out and take a dive at one of the coral reef nurseries where that work is underway. And even just participating in that program alone, having the opportunity to see some of this work firsthand, then put some resources back into those organizations that can kind of help them do the work that they're doing. And if you enjoy what you happen to do on any of those days, you might choose to get involved more yourself.
Tom is, there's a term that you've been hearing more about, this idea of voluntourism, right? And it's definitely something that is happening as we speak and rather organically. And I think that's yet another area that we can take more of a leadership role. We are working on a specific program through our meetings and convention services department. As I mentioned, that's a big part of what we do. And, 9 out of 10 times, we are now being asked from those meeting and event planners, okay, I'm bringing my meeting and convention, but tell me what our delegates can do on a give back day or a volunteer day. And I think more and more, those are going to be funneled to the types of sustainable resiliency type initiatives that Tom alluded to. And we're working proactively on that. And yet again, I think this collaboration and making sure that partners like yourselves and others are aware, because those things could be repurposed not only for people that are coming from out of town, and we've got already some great volunteer programs within Miami-Dade County, and it's frankly repurposing and better educating whether you're a resident or in this case a visitor when you're coming in, because that aspect of CSR, you know, that social responsibility is now baked into every entity, large or small. And I think we can take advantage of that in a positive way, especially from a visitor and tourism perspective, and channel that into not only having a practical impact, whether it's cleaning up, but also, you know, becoming thought leaders and from a PR perspective, which is a big part of my business, by drawing attention to what we're doing as a community, which in essence will then fuel more discussion about this issue and hopefully the resources that are needed to combat it in the long term.
Right. And it will also help draw that type of new tourists that you're.
There you go. There you go.
Miami, right? As you put that information out. Dr. Shimon, you were about to say
Yes,
something.
I want to mention that there is the concept also of citizen science, in which everybody can join a science project and help. And at FIU, we have a request, and many times we have a lot of participation from citizens to measure during king tides, to measure where they see the high tide in their environments and to report to us. So there are tools, there are apps for that. So citizen science is also a very important tool for actually getting educated and help scientists to pursue the goal in monitoring, in this case, the king tide events or studying sea level and how it impacts the urban environment in this case.
And I think this idea to include both residents, but also visitors and tourists to collect that data that we so desperately need to make those new decisions, to monitor the resources, to meet those sustainable development goals is such a key aspect, right? And it also makes it a more interesting experience for everybody, both residents and tourists. You know, how cool is it if you can go out on a dive and actually count what type of fish you're seeing or what type of coral you're seeing, and then we can use that information to help us monitor and regenerate the resource. Same with the Everglades. So I think there are many more opportunities. I know we're almost short on time. Are there any questions from any of the attendees towards the panelists, or any last comments, last suggestions, words?
You know, I'll close by reiterating, I think Elaine mentioned the word balance, and I think that is so critical. When you look at the history of Miami-Dade County, the impact of tourism, and I think on a net basis, I would submit to you respectfully that tourism has been amazingly good for this community overall. But I do think moving forward that this balance between having that ongoing successful tourism ecosystem and the jobs that it sustains and the economic impact that it generates, which ultimately translates into quality of life for our residents, now needs to be more resident-centric than ever. And you know, visitors come and go, but you know, I've been here my whole life. I'm raising my family here, so, and hopefully they'll raise their family here. So we need to be that much more invested. And what's good for our what's good for our residents is good for our visitors. So sustaining that balance, once again, is going to be critical moving forward.
Any final words?
I
other
wanted to
panelists?
add that having forums like these are extremely important. So thank you so much for organizing that, and keeping the dialogue going is essential. So thank you for that.
Yes, I agree. It's very important to have this communication between all the stakeholders in the tourist industry, in the residents, and everybody, the scientific community. So we should continue events like that. Thank you for inviting me.
Tom, any last thoughts?
Thanks for having me. Sorry I couldn't be here. I'd love to have a conversation with you guys again and more in depth about this. I couldn't agree more with what Orlando said about, how these things are so inexplicably linked, and would ask that, those of you that think about also how we do tourism development in the future, and as we think about where we put our resources at, to remember that, that infrastructure in this regard isn't necessarily always bridges and highways and things like that, but it can be the natural infrastructure that draws some of the people to these communities in the first place and is also worthy of investment.
Right. And I wanted to thank all of you guys. I'm going to give the word over to Jillian to finish this webinar for us. But I wanted to thank everybody, and I agree that if we are to succeed, I think we need to continue these conversations, these collaborations, and come up with new solutions to really, really move forward sustainably. So thank you, Jillian, for having all of us.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you to Dr. Lusby, Dr. Bushman, to Marcos, and to our distinguished panel. This has been a really great conversation, and we hope that, this is something that people will want to learn more about. And as we close, just wanted to let all of the attendees know that we'll be sending out an email with the recording of this webinar. And we'll also include links to read more and be able to do more research on what was discussed in this panel. And have a wonderful day, and thank you very much.